Imagine waking up one morning to find your money wasn't really money anymore. No wars, no explosions, no panic, just one quiet announcement that changed everything. It was a calm Sunday evening, August 15th, 1971. Families sat around their televisions, kids finishing dinner, parents half listening to the news. Nothing felt unusual, but inside the White House, President Richard Nixon was about to make a decision that would quietly rewrite the rules of global power. He stepped to the podium, calm and confident, speaking in a measured tone. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That single sentence ended centuries of financial order. The temporary suspension never ended. From that night on, the dollar was no longer backed by gold, only by trust. Money stopped being something you could hold and became something you could only believe in. Most people watching thought it was just another policy update, but it was a quiet revolution. The day value, debt, and power were redefined. When Nixon closed the gold window, he didn't just change America's money, he changed what money meant. Before we go deeper, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you love stories that uncover the hidden machinery of money, power, and empires, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened in 1971 wasn't just an economic shift. It was the moment the world quietly changed forever.
To understand why Nixon's decision shattered the world, you first have to understand the system he destroyed. After World War II, the world was broke. Currencies collapsed, gold reserves scattered, and economies in ruins. So, in 1944, 44 nations gathered at a small resort in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Their mission was simple: rebuild global trust in money. The solution was elegant. Every currency would be pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce. The United States, holding 3/4 of the world's gold, became the world's banker. It was a system built on discipline and faith. Gold anchored the dollar, and the dollar anchored the world. For decades, it worked beautifully. Trade flourished, economies recovered, and the American dollar became as good as gold. But beneath the stability, cracks were already forming. The system depended on America's restraint. It could not print more dollars than it had gold to back them, and that restraint wouldn't last, because power tempts even the most disciplined. By the 1960s, America was spending recklessly, financing wars abroad and welfare at home, while pretending nothing had changed. The world believed in the dollar, but the gold behind it was slipping away. The stage was set for the most dramatic financial betrayal in modern history, a quiet heist disguised as economic necessity. By the 1960s, the illusion of stability began to crumble. The United States was printing more dollars than ever before, funding the Vietnam War, the space race, and massive domestic programs. But under the Bretton Woods system, every dollar in circulation represented a promise, a claim to real gold sitting in Fort Knox. And that promise was being broken, quietly. Foreign nations began to notice. France's President Charles de Gaulle was the first to call America's bluff. He accused the US of exporting paper instead of real value, printing wealth while others paid the price. Then, in 1965, he did something no one expected. He sent a French naval ship across the Atlantic to exchange US dollars for gold. The ship arrived in New York Harbor loaded with paper and left heavy with gold bars. It was a diplomatic earthquake. Other nations soon followed. Germany, Japan, and even Britain began redeeming dollars for gold. America's vaults started to drain. In 1958, the US held about $20 billion in gold. By 1971, less than half remained, and only a small fraction of that was available to foreign governments. Meanwhile, over $50 billion US were circulating globally. The math was impossible. If everyone demanded their gold, there wouldn't be enough to go around. The world was witnessing a slow-motion bank run, not by citizens, but by entire nations. And as ships kept coming for their gold, Nixon's team knew the truth. America's empire was running out of metal to hide behind. By the summer of 1971, the numbers didn't lie. America was bleeding gold. Inflation was rising, unemployment growing, and foreign governments were lining up to trade their dollars for metal the US no longer had. Behind closed doors, panic spread through Washington. In a secluded retreat at Camp David, President Nixon gathered his inner circle, men like Henry Kissinger, Treasury Secretary John Connally, and Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns. They debated one question: how to save the system before it collapsed. Connally, ever blunt, summed it up: "The foreigners are out to screw us. Our job is to screw them first." The room laughed, but the message was deadly serious. America would default, not openly, but elegantly. The gold window would close. On August 15, 1971, Nixon appeared on television. His tone was calm, reassuring, almost paternal. "I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." That word, temporarily, was a lie the world accepted. Overnight, money was no longer tied to anything real. The promise that every dollar could be redeemed for gold was gone forever. At first, nothing seemed to change. The next morning, people went to work, bought groceries, and paid their bills. But the foundation beneath the entire global economy had shifted. The rules of value, trust, and trade had been rewritten in a single broadcast. It wasn't called theft, but history would remember it as the Nixon shock. The night paper replaced gold, and faith replaced truth.
When Nixon killed the gold standard, the world expected chaos, and for a while, it got exactly that. Currencies swung wildly, inflation exploded, trust in the dollar wavered. Without gold, America's money had no anchor, just faith. But faith alone doesn't run empires. So behind the scenes, Washington built a new foundation, one not made of metal, but of oil. In the early 1970s, the U.S. struck a secret deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter. The arrangement was simple, but revolutionary. The Saudis would sell oil only in U.S. dollars, and in return, America would provide military protection and access to its markets. Other OPEC nations followed. The Petrodollar was born. This single move changed everything. Every country now needed U.S. dollars to buy energy, the lifeblood of modern civilization. To get those dollars, they had to trade with America, borrow from American banks, or buy U.S. debt. Demand for the dollar roared back to life, not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by necessity. The brilliance and danger of the petrodollar system was that it made America's currency the oxygen of global trade. Even nations that distrusted Washington still needed its money. The U.S. could now print endless dollars, export inflation abroad, and sanction enemies by simply cutting them off from the system. It was a new kind of empire, not ruled by armies, but by markets. A world where control wasn't enforced with guns, but with green paper and oil barrels. The gold standard had died, but in its ashes, a financial empire far more powerful was born. The new system worked for a while. With gold gone and oil propping up the dollar, America entered a new financial age, one where debt replaced discipline and printing replaced productivity. Politicians discovered a dangerous truth. You could buy prosperity, at least temporarily, by creating money out of nothing. In the 1970s, the consequences hit hard. Prices soared, wages couldn't keep up, gas lines stretched for blocks. The same dollar that once bought a full bag of groceries could barely fill a tank of fuel. Economists called it stagflation. For ordinary families, it felt like slow economic suffocation. But Wall Street saw opportunity in the chaos. Easy money meant speculation. Borrow cheap, buy assets, and let inflation do the rest. The rich began to thrive not by producing, but by owning. Real estate, stocks, commodities, anything that rose with prices became the new gold. The middle class, once the foundation of America's power, started to hollow out. The game had changed, and only those closest to the money printer could win. By the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker promised to restore stability. Volcker raised interest rates to nearly 20%, crushing inflation, but also triggering a brutal recession. Millions lost jobs, businesses folded, yet the system survived. But it survived by evolving into something even more dangerous. Debt became normal. Credit cards replaced savings. The dollar's power no longer came from restraint, but from faith that Washington would always find a way to print its way out of trouble. It was the illusion of strength built on the addiction of debt. And like every addiction, it came with a price. By the late 20th century, the United States had discovered its ultimate export: debt. From Wall Street to the White House, the logic was simple. If the world needed dollars, then America could borrow forever. And so it did. The 1880s and 1990s became the age of financial engineering. Money wasn't just a medium of exchange, it was a product. Derivatives, bonds, and credit became the new weapons of empire. Foreign nations held trillions in U.S. debt, funding American consumption in exchange for paper promises. Factories left, jobs vanished, but markets soared. The illusion of prosperity was alive, fueled by borrowed time and borrowed money. Then came 2008, the moment the illusion cracked. Decades of easy credit collapsed under the weight of subprime mortgages and toxic assets. Global panic followed. But instead of letting the system reset, the Federal Reserve doubled down. Trillions of new dollars were created overnight to bail out the same institutions that caused the collapse. It worked, temporarily. Stocks recovered, banks survived, and debt exploded. That moment marked the final transformation of America's financial empire, from productive strength to monetary control. Every crisis would now be met with more printing, more borrowing, and more manipulation. The system had become too fragile to fail and too addicted to stop.
The empire that once conquered through innovation now survived through inflation. The dollar's dominance became its weapon and its weakness, because when your power depends on debt, one day your creditors start asking questions. Empires never believe they're collapsing until the collapse is already history. The British pound once ruled the world until war and debt destroyed its illusion. Now the dollar stands in the same place, powerful on the surface, hollow underneath. For 50 years, America has lived on borrowed trust, turning money into policy and debt into destiny. But trust is the most fragile currency of all. Every empire thinks it's different. Rome thought its legions would last forever. Britain thought its colonies would never leave. America believes the dollar is untouchable. Yet the numbers tell another story. Debt past 35 trillion, interest payments larger than defense spending, and a world slowly preparing for life after the dollar. Nations like China, Russia, and the BRICS alliance are building systems outside U.S. control. Central banks are hoarding gold again. Confidence is fading. The end of a monetary empire never comes with an explosion. It comes with silence, a slow loss of faith, a quiet retreat from the system everyone once believed unshakable. When the final reckoning comes, it won't be gold or oil that decides the future. It'll be trust. Because money, at its core, is a story we all agree to believe. And when that story breaks, power shifts, wealth moves, history resets. Nixon thought he was saving the dollar. Instead, he ended an era.